Hello, I'm Stephen Handler. I work with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. The textbook definition of climate change vulnerability is the degree to which a system is susceptible or unable to cope with negative impacts from climate change. So, a couple of things you need to keep in mind when you're actually setting about to define vulnerability is that you need to be really clear about what kind of vulnerability you're talking about. So you need to define the topic that you're assessing vulnerability of. You need to define the geographic scale over which you're assessing vulnerability, as well as the time scale that you're paying attention to. So answering all of those three questions is really a fundamental first step to defining vulnerability. So vulnerability has three components, and those are sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. And these three ideas together can help you get a sense of overall vulnerability to climate change. We think of sensitivity to climate change kind of like how much a system will react to a given amount of stress. We think of exposure as how much stress is that system going to be exposed to. Those two elements, sensitivity and exposure, they are combined to give you a sense of what are the overall potential impacts of climate change. Going one step further, once you have a sense of the impacts that might result from climate change, you can think of the adaptive capacity of that system to change, which is how well can a system tolerate or cope with those impacts. So I like to use an analogy to help think about vulnerability. So imagine you were thinking about my vulnerability to getting a sunburn, right? We would look at my sensitivity to sun, and that is, how much pigment is in my skin, how much will I burn if I'm in the sun for a given amount of time. My exposure would be, how long am I going to be out in the sun on a given day? And my adaptive capacity would be, do I have clothing or the ability to move out of the sun, right? So I would need to look at each three of those elements to decide what's my risk of getting a sunburn today. The last thing I'll say about vulnerability is that it is an essential first step before launching into more comprehensive adaptation planning. It's really fundamental to have a clear idea of what is at risk and how much risk is a system likely to experience before you make decisions about how to adapt and how to prepare. So vulnerability is really the essential first piece in deciding how to respond to climate change. Now remember, sensitivity is a sense of how will that system be affected by stress? How will it be affected by the potential impacts of climate change? In a forestry setting, there are many potential tools and techniques we have to come to an overall sense of climate change sensitivity. A couple of those elements are forest impact models that tell us how might climate change affect how species grow and reproduce and compete against each other. There's also a really big body, growing body of published literature on climate change impacts to forests. And then it's also really important to include the expertise and management experience of folks who have been working with a system in a particular place for a long time. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge that might not be in the published literature that is also important to bring to bear on this issue of climate change sensitivity. So it's important to combine all three of those sources of information to come up with an overall sense of climate change sensitivity. So as I said, adaptive capacity is a component of overall climate change vulnerability. And getting an assessment of adaptive capacity is sometimes tricky because we don't have actual models or quantitative science in a lot of cases to assess adaptive capacity. So you may have to think about this a little more qualitatively or holistically. In a forest setting, for example, if I were to think about the adaptive capacity of a forest type or an individual property to climate change, I would be thinking about what are the aspects of this setting or system that give it some resilience to cope with change. And so those would be things like genetic diversity, species diversity, structural or age class diversity, right? So ways that all of your risk can be spread around. I would also be looking at is a forest type limited to a specific kind of habitat, or does it have the ability to migrate and move and appear in multiple different physical settings? Those are all things that would give a forest higher adaptive capacity, higher ability to tolerate change. Add in there some forest types and species have different ways that they respond to disturbance. So some forests have a life history strategy that allows them to respond to fire and wind events, pest outbreaks, things like that. In other contexts, you may actually include some human dimensions and socioeconomic considerations in thinking about adaptive capacity. So for an example, if we are looking at an agricultural setting, we're also going to be looking at what on-farm production practices are available that might allow a farmer to avoid some negative climate change impacts. We might also look at financial instruments like insurance, right? Is insurance an important part of avoiding risk or coping with change? When you're conducting a vulnerability assessment, it's important not to give the impression that you have all the answers and that we know exactly how climate change is going to manifest for a given system or a resource that you're assessing. This has been a shortcoming in vulnerability assessments in the past, but it's becoming more and more common now to disclose confidence as a component of climate change vulnerability. That is, how sure are we of a given set of impacts to a system or a resource? When assessing your confidence in a vulnerability determination, it can be helpful to think about two aspects that can inform an overall level of confidence. And that is, number one, what is the overall amount of information that is available to support that determination of vulnerability? And number two, does that information tend to agree, or are there multiple conflicting viewpoints within that information? When assessing vulnerability of forests in the northern United States, our team looked at both the amount of information and the agreement of that information on a scale to ultimately come up with an accurate depiction of confidence in our vulnerability determinations. In this sort of format, a large amount of evidence and a high agreement within that evidence would lead you to have a higher confidence in your vulnerability conclusions. On the other hand, if there's not much information available, or if that information tends to conflict and lead to different conclusions, well, that would reduce the confidence you might have in a vulnerability assessment. So over a period of about a year and a half, our team from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and dozens of partners from the research and management community across Minnesota worked together to come up with a climate change vulnerability assessment for forests in northern Minnesota. When we put all the pieces of information together, when we looked at climate change projections for the future, when we looked at the results of forest impact models, and when we brought the experience and expertise of managers to the table, there were a few themes that kept rising to the surface that seemed to be the major impacts to forests over the next century. And a couple of those were that forests will be experiencing a longer growing season in the future. We have a very clear trend of increasing growing seasons over the past several decades, and we expect that trend to continue into the future. Another major trend would be that more of our precipitation is being delivered in heavy rainfall events, right? So these extreme pulses of rainfall, those are becoming more and more frequent, and we expect more of our future precipitation to be delivered from those kinds of events. We're also expecting warmer temperatures throughout the year, particularly in winter, which leads to other indirect effects such as reduced snowfall and more rain in the wintertime instead of snow, a reduced period of frozen ground, which also leads to indirect effects from potentially more damage from forest health issues like insect pests and diseases. Forest impact models also suggest that ranges of tree species will be shifting over the next century, which was another major impact that our team discussed and analyzed as a component of our overall vulnerability assessment. When this team of managers and researchers was deciding how are we going to design our vulnerability assessment, we ended up deciding that we would focus on 8 forest systems across northern Minnesota. And those are 6 native plant communities that are common, and these definitions are accepted by multiple partners in Minnesota. So we used 6 native plant community systems, as well as 2 managed forest systems, which are high economic and social importance in northern Minnesota. So we systematically assessed potential impacts, exposure, and adaptive capacity of each of these forest systems. And as you can see, we came up with different conclusions as to how vulnerable each of these forest systems might be over the next 100 years. Importantly, in this vulnerability assessment, we had to define what did we mean precisely by vulnerability. And so in our instance, we defined vulnerability as if a system is susceptible to a change in its extent, if a system is vulnerable to a change in its health, or if a system was vulnerable to a change in its identity, right? If certain characteristics might change within that system which would make it unrecognizable. Each of those 3 things would lead us to consider that system vulnerable. Now, if you were focused on agricultural production instead of forest ecosystems for your climate change vulnerability assessment, it would turn out that a lot of the climate change impacts might be similar in an agricultural setting to a forest setting. Producers in a variety of agricultural fields are looking at impacts of warmer temperatures, particularly warmer nights, shifting precipitation patterns, greater stress from pests and diseases, including animal parasites, as well as maybe greater competition from weeds and non-desirable species. So these climate change impacts for agriculture are similar in a lot of ways to the impacts we're most concerned about for forests. If your organization and your partners want to work on a climate change vulnerability assessment for a resource that you care about, I would say your first priority is to really define what it is that you want to learn about with this vulnerability assessment. So clearly define what system or species or geographic area are you considering, and what things are you leaving out. It's important to be explicit about that so that your determinations of vulnerability can be more precise. Another thing you should do when setting out to conduct a vulnerability assessment is to spend some time learning about what information already exists. Now, there's a great body of published literature on climate change impacts for a whole variety of disciplines. That scientific literature is growing all the time. And there's also a growing catalog of climate change vulnerability assessments that have already been completed for a variety of resources and a variety of places across the country. There are a number of websites that are now available to catalog vulnerability assessments that have been produced. So it would also be worthwhile investigating those to see if there's an assessment that captures your area or your particular resource, or that might be a template of a process that you want to emulate. And another great initial step when coming together to initiate a climate change vulnerability assessment is to form a team that really represents a full spectrum of interests for the resource that you're assessing. So if it's in a natural ecosystem context, try to get researchers who have a long history of working in that system, as well as land managers who might also deal with that system. Bringing those multiple perspectives together will really help inform and contribute to a more useful assessment that can be used both by the research community and the management community. So, in natural ecosystems, adaptive capacity can be thought about purely in kind of an ecosystem concept. How well will that system adapt to change? If your vulnerability assessment addresses issues like urban planning or the vulnerability of agricultural systems, you may also include some human dimensions in your assessment of adaptive capacity. So in the example of urban planning, for a particular city or a municipality, if you were evaluating vulnerability to climate change, you would also try to include things like how many institutions, governmental and non-governmental, are available to help your citizens and different sectors of the economy cope with change. You would also probably look at what kind of financial resources are available to your city or municipality to, again, cope with change and respond to stresses and unplanned events. This video has really just scratched the surface in terms of what you need to know before launching into or designing a climate change vulnerability assessment. There are many great resources available that can really help you learn more about what processes and frameworks are available to you to assess climate change vulnerability of a whole variety of systems or resources that you might care about.